General Motors has developed a bit of a reputation for making bizarre marketing decisions, from commonly selling the same car under a multitude of different names, to forgetting to switch all the badges on the European version of the Oldsmobile Alero, to the committee-designed nightmare that was the Pontiac Aztek. There have been some real head-scratchers in the company's history. A good example of one is when GM of Mexico decided to sell a version of the Opel Corsa B in their country. Despite not being designed by Chevrolet, GM decided to market the vehicle as the Chevrolet Chevy. But nonetheless, the Chevy was a massive hit in Mexico, topping sales charts years after its supposed replacement was introduced. In this video, I'll briefly go over the history of this little car, try to figure out why it was so successful.
Este es tu Chevy y nada se le compara.
¡Wow! Buena onda, General Motors.
Chevy, con tu concesionario.
The story of the Chevy begins with the second generation of Opel Corsa. The first generation of the B-segment hatchback, which had been sold as the Vauxhall Nova in the UK, was quite a popular vehicle throughout its production run. However, by the early 1990s, the 10-year-old Corsa A was looking a bit stale. So, in 1993, the Corsa B was launched. It featured a sleek, modern design and a range of economical engines, making it appealing to a wide range of different markets. In 1994, the Spanish-built Corsa entered the Mexican market. According to a period article in the New York Times, GM of Mexico wouldn't have decided to import the car without the passage of the North American Free Trade Agreement. While NAFTA's main effect was creating a free trade zone between the US, Canada, and Mexico, it also had the side effect of reducing Mexico's import restrictions in general. In the past, auto manufacturers in Mexico were required to export more than they imported, which severely limited the number of vehicle models in Mexico. Now, GM could enter the affordable, low-end car market without much actual effort. GM was worried that importing a car from Spain to Mexico would put some customers off, so they decided to make the car sound friendly and familiar. The Opel brand wasn't really a thing in Mexico, so they decided to call it a Chevrolet. But of course, they still needed a model name, and for that they decided to use Chevy, as it was a familiar nickname for, well, Chevrolet. Name aside, the car proved quite popular when it was first introduced in Mexico. After importing just 1,700 cars in all of 1993, GM of Mexico imported over 5,500 Chevys in just 5 months. It was initially available as either a 3-door hatchback called the Joy or a 5-door hatchback called the Swing. It featured a 5-speed manual transmission and a 1.4-liter Opel 4-cylinder engine, with around 60 horsepower. The car got around 40 miles per gallon, which is quite impressive for the time. Compared to the Volkswagen Beetle that was straight out of the 1930s and the Spartan Nissan Suru, the Chevy seemed fun, fresh, and appealing for first-time car buyers. However, importing the car still wasn't ideal. Mexico still placed a 20% tariff on non-North American imports, and given the initial success of the Spanish-built Chevy, GM of Mexico decided to produce the Chevy domestically at the Ramos Arizpe plant. GM also expanded the Chevy lineup to include a sedan version, sometimes called the Monza, and, in 1999, a station wagon version. There's also a pickup, which I think is just adorable. In 2002, the newer Corsa C was introduced in Mexico as the Chevrolet Corsa. One would assume that the Corsa C's arrival would correspond with the discontinuation of the Corsa B, but GM of Mexico decided to keep selling the Chevy as a lower-cost option. In fact, the Chevy received a small refresh in 2004. The Chevy C2 was still wildly successful, despite not having actually changed much. It managed to overtake the Nissan Suru as the best-selling vehicle in Mexico in 2004, despite now being a decade old. And while the Suru would return to the top the next year, the Chevy remained in the top 3 until 2008. Years after its introduction, the Chevy had embedded itself into Mexican culture. It was a favorite among taxi drivers, first-time buyers, and everyone in between. 8 years after being discontinued in Europe, the Chevy got another facelift. It looks like GM grafted the front end of a 2008 Malibu onto a 1990s Opel, because that's probably what they did. Nevertheless, the Chevy C3 was still in the top 10 best-selling cars in 2008 and 2009. By this point, only two body styles of the Chevy were still sold, the Chevy 3-door and the Chevy sedan. However, by this point, GM of Mexico was focusing on selling the Daewoo-designed Aveo rather than the ancient, but probably better, Chevy. In the early 2010s, GM invested 500 million pesos into the Ramos Arizpe plant to allow for the production of the new Chevrolet Sonic. The incredibly reliable source of Wikipedia also says that Mexico was about to require standard front airbags, which the Chevy, of course, did not have. That meant that despite strong sales, the Chevy would end production in 2011. To send off this iconic little car, GM introduced the Chevy Edición Especial Joy 2012. It featured a silver and gold stripe, a Joy emblem, and a plaque to verify that it is indeed a real special edition Chevy. And with that, the Chevy drove into the sunset. Older models tend to survive longer in Mexico than they do in many other markets, and the Chevy is no exception. It managed to continue being one of Mexico's best-selling cars 11 years after it was discontinued in Europe. And it wasn't just Mexico either, because the Corsa B proved popular in other Latin American markets, such as Argentina and Cumbia. It was affordable, economical, and simple, perfect for the needs of millions. And while the Chevy wasn't always as popular as the beloved Vocho or even the Nissan Suru, Mexican car culture would certainly be a very different place without it.